they were both very much in love with how they were viewed in society. You know, their family and their name, their power.
He was addicted, whether he was addicted to opioids or was he just addicted to money?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. How did Alex Murdaugh actually pull off some of his financial crimes? What is the scheme? What is the trick that he used? Well, episode 3 of the HBO series reveals the answer. Now, from the outside looking in, I suspect we have the bull by the tail, and we're seeing the trees rather than the woods. Is this the story of a man who is trying to keep his lifestyle, trying to hold on to the Murdaugh legacy, or was the whole thing a fraud and, you know, from the start, was the whole thing keeping up appearances to begin with? In other words, did Alex Murdaugh know that the Murdaugh magic was lost, long gone, and eventually it was nothing more than a contrivance, and nothing more than a series of contrivances going back decades? And so the whole contrivance was one that he needed to pretend was still there. He knew the Murdaugh magic was long gone. So there was power, yes, but contrived power. Influence, yes, but engineered influence rather than actual. Because if there's one way to define the Murdaugh case, in a nutshell, it's not a real lawyer doing real lawyer work, but a fake lawyer committing fraud again and again and again. In other words, not real law, but fake law. Not real money, but stolen money. Not real influence, but illegitimate influence. Not real power, but fake power. And what is driving all of this? Greed. Now, from the HBO docuseries, we're going to go through 12 insights from that final third episode. And I think all of this greed goes into that family value system as well. Not a real husband, but a philanderer and a cheat. Not a real father, but a greedy addict who only thinks about himself. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Thank you to the thousands of you who have subscribed over the last couple of days. Welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, the first thing is, when does the appearances thing start? You know, if appearances are deceiving and it was all about keeping up appearances, when did the whole appearances thing start? Well, if you bear in mind that Maggie knew that Alex had cheated on her 15 years earlier, it gives you an idea that the appearances thing started really early on. That almost like the royal family, it is keeping up appearances from the get-go. And so I think you do have to be more specific and say, well, when exactly did it start? And I think the scary thing isn't how or why that criminal seed was sown, but for how long it germinated before anybody knew about it. And where we are right now, Randy Murdaugh has just given an interview to the New York Times saying he's still not sure what has happened. There are some people in that documentary that still swear that he must be innocent. And obviously this was made just before the trial. I think the most terrifying stories in true crime aren't stories that involve strangers entering a fabric, like Brian Koberger. I mean, that is scary. But what's far more terrifying is where someone you know and love and trust, when that someone turns out to be a stranger, and it turns out you never knew them at all, you never knew who they really were. And they're not only a stranger, they're not a harmless stranger. So, you know, when it's your own father, husband, that kills those closest to him, and swindles just about everybody he possibly can, and yet he still exists in his family, in his community, as a kind of folk hero, a kind of heroic figure. It makes you wonder how much of the world we know is real, how many wolves are among us. Number 2, little white lies. What was Alex Murdaugh's greatest fraud? Well, I think it was fooling people into believing he wasn't an addict. In the HBO documentary, we hear that the pill popping goes back 20 years.
I've been doing a lot of thinking just about taking all these pills and how that all started, and I mean, this just goes back 20 years.
Giving the appearance that the plaintiff's settlement money went to Forge Consulting. But that's actually a personal bank account.
For some people, cheating other people is almost like sex to them.
So do you see how little white lies start with little white pills? Number 3, money doesn't buy the American dream. There's something very haunting about the whole Murdaugh case, and I think what it shows is that being rich doesn't change who you are on the inside. It doesn't actually fill some kind of void. Because you've got to wonder why he's taking all these pills to begin with. What's missing? And his brother Randy, in a recent New York Times article, says that they were nothing alike, that he didn't really even have much of a relationship with his brother. So I think what the Murdaugh case reveals is something far more troubling than one privileged man giving himself over to the dark side. In a Great Gatsby sense, but also in a modern Gatsby sense, it gnaws at the idea of the American dream, because on paper, the Murdaugh family were living it. They were living this fairy tale. Paul, Buster, Maggie, and Alex the patriarch, were living their lives everyone else wished they could be living. Well, everyone wished they could be living that surface life. Did anyone want to live what was going on underneath that? Did anyone really want to be Maggie? In the first 5 minutes of episode 3, in the HBO docuseries, rumors of Alex having a mistress surface. Rumors of Alex and Maggie living separate lives comes to light. As early as August 2nd of last year, Fitz News interviewed a South Carolina sex worker, Lindsay Edwards. That's only just making the mainstream media news now, more than 6 months later. But there you have it, lust, one of the 7 deadly sins. Number 4, a fairy tale family or infidelity, keeping up appearances and faking it. Well, according to the Daily Mail, quote, Murdaugh's sister-in-law Marion Proctor told the judge that she believed that Alex Murdaugh had cheated on Maggie 15 years ago, and that Maggie had actually brought up his infidelity around the time of the murders. She said she didn't think anyone was still going on, but it was just still bothering her, according to her sister. Well, Maggie was right to feel something was bothering her. Maggie was also right not wanting to go to Moselle when Alex summoned her there. And there's a text saying, something's up. That Alex is up to something. And she's right, but she goes there anyway. Now, although Murdaugh on trial swore that Maggie was still the apple of his eye, and others have said how much they knew he loved her, well, Maggie didn't seem to think so. Maggie, it's been suggested, wanted a divorce, had been talking to divorce lawyers, and with Paul out of school, why not then? Why not begin that process? Well, because Alex couldn't afford it. Literally, he couldn't afford it financially, and he couldn't afford to have his derelict finances exposed, and a divorce and an audit would expose that. Number 5, how strategic are the deceits? This was, I thought, one of the strongest little insights that came out of episode 3. You actually heard the producers kind of gasping and saying, wow, it's really calculated, isn't it? So if we weren't dealing with Alex Murdaugh and you were asked to consider what sort of crimes a crooked lawyer, a lawyer who knows how to manipulate the law, how might he do just that? Would you imagine more or less strategic deceits compared to what you see in true crime? And I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to answer that. I don't think you need a sophisticated understanding of this case in order to see all the instances where someone gets hurt and a Murdaugh lawyer or a proxy steps forward out of the ether. Hey, I'll help you. And when this happens, there's sometimes a cash cow at the end of the legal rainbow, while at other times there's just the sound of crickets. There's just the sound of crickets in the Mallory case, just the sound of crickets at the end of the Stephen Smith incident. Well, isn't that by design? If we take the murders of Maggie and Paul, were they strategic? And I think this is a very interesting question. Was Maggie murdered to get Maggie's money via inheriting her estates? Bear in mind, the day of her murder, the day of Paul's murder, Alex Murdaugh finds out that his firm knows he's absconded money from them. And so he needs money, I guess, in a hurry. He needs a solution in a hurry. So was Maggie murdered to get Maggie's money via inheriting her estates and not losing anything in a divorce and not having to go through an audit? And Paul's murder, was that intended to dodge Paul's boating incident, but also using that incident to say that, well, it's because of Paul, to blame young vigilantes seeking revenge. Now take Gloria Satterfield. If you basically see the second episode as focusing around Stephen Smith, then Gloria Satterfield plays a fairly significant role in the narrative of the third episode. Now think about what's going on in 2018. Murdaugh already has serious debts at that point. He's already been defrauding for maybe about a decade. But he also has serious accident insurance in place. And people have been saying, why on earth would a lawyer who's got insurance for everything not have life insurance on Paul and Maggie? Anyway, he's got accident insurance in place. He is a personal injury lawyer. So does he fatally injure their housekeeper of 20 years on purpose? Because he needs a few million to throw at the debt monster, that's this debt maw that is widening around him. And just as we saw in the murders of Paul and Maggie, Alex Murdaugh is mysteriously absent when Gloria falls, but then miraculously present immediately afterward, just in time to hear her say, "The dogs made me fall," before she lapses into a coma. Also, do you notice how the dogs are sort of a background for Gloria Satterfield, but also for Maggie and Paul? Number 6, keeping up false appearances. So now we come down to it. How was, for example, the payment from the Satterfield case ultimately steered to Alex Murdaugh? How did he do it? Well, it's actually simple semantics, just using a word with kind of a double meaning. The bank it was supposed to go to was called Forge Consulting, and Murdaugh then just created his own account, a personal account, which he simply called Forge,
giving the appearance that the plaintiff's settlement money went to Forge Consulting. But that's actually a personal bank account.
Right? So those following up would see, it's going to Forge, not a problem. And they would have assumed payments to Forge, to Alex, were actually being made to Forge Consulting when they weren't. So he was counting on clumsiness, laziness, simple errors. But there was something else going on as well, institutional evil. That's number 7. The Murdaugh family isn't the only dynasty in the Low Country. There are also others. And lo and behold, what sort of business do these other families run? What I thought was quite interesting with the docuseries was they described the people living in Hampton County as basically politicians, lawyers, bankers, and then and they're all in some kind of relationship with one another. And then you sort of just got sort of poor people on the periphery to that whole arrangement. And so what sort of business do some of these other families run? Well, banking for one. And so Murdaugh, because he's a Murdaugh, gets special treatment. And because he gets special treatment, he avoids protocols, right? And because he avoids protocols, his frauds easily slip through the cracks. They slip through the cracks in ways that they wouldn't otherwise have for an ordinary person. And then, like an addiction, because no one recognizes what he's doing, he eventually can't stop himself. It's like a pig at a trough. This is what happens after years and years of not having any accountability. Self-destruction. where your worst enemy is yourself. And if you can take out your housekeeper of 20 years, that's an if. We don't know for sure. But if you do that, how hard is the next step? You weren't accountable for that, so why would you be accountable for the next thing? Number 8, Alex covering for Paul, and then Alex covering for Alex. So this is also suggested in the series. One of the strongest arguments fielded in the trial, I thought, was the prosecution lawyer during closing, repeating that although he may have loved Paul and Maggie, Alex didn't love anyone as much as he loved Alex. I mean, that is the bottom line with drug addicts. They are feeding themselves feel-good feelings that trump literally everything else. That's the most important thing. By definition, that makes everything and everyone else expendable to one's own feelings, which means you are the most important person in your life. The HBO series suggests that Paul actually may have pushed or tripped the housekeeper. You can hear his attitude on the 911 call. He gets irritated by being asked questions. And Alex and Maggie, perhaps, if Paul did do that, perhaps they helped cover this up. Well, if there was going to be a trial on a separate incident, on the Mallory Beach incident, and Paul or Maggie were going to be called to testify on the Satterfield thing as a sort of preliminary matter to the Mallory Beach incident, to give a sense of what other things, nefarious activities may have been going on, in the same way that fraud played a sort of the background music to the double homicide in the Alex Murdaugh case, well, what happened to Gloria Satterfield could do the same in terms of the Mallory Beach incident, right? And, well, that wouldn't do. So is that why Paul and Maggie were murdered? Because of what they knew about that? It may be that Alex benefited from the Satterfield incident. Could be that he didn't have anything to do with it directly, but then indirectly he decided to get rid of witnesses, when he knew that he'd benefited from it and he knew that his financial machinations would be under the microscope. If the murders of Paul and Maggie were meant to appear a certain way to distract attention from Alex, his coming clean regarding his drug addiction, as well as the attempt to take his own life, that whole staging thing, weren't they also efforts to distract attention from the thing at the bottom of all of these things? Stolen treasure.
For some people, cheating other people is almost like sex to them. For some people, cheating other people is almost like sex to them.
Stolen treasure is the thing that Murdaugh was trying to protect, right? But that's not the only reason I think that he was doing it. He was enjoying, getting one over the people around him. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Stolen treasure was what Murdaugh was really trying to hide, and all other things were secondary. But do you see again why the primary motive here is greed? Number 9, a grotesque inversion of Robin Hood. On paper, you might say greed isn't such a bad thing. So what if you're a little selfish? Maybe most of us are. But the equation doesn't start and end with someone becoming better off, or a lot better off than they should. In Alex Murdaugh's case, $10 million better off. It's not just that someone accumulates that money. You've also got to factor into your calculus the person that is made worse off. That person, and another person, and another one, another one, another one, another one. Robin Hood stole from the rich and gave to the poor. Murdaugh stole from the poor, about $10 million from the poor, in order to spoil his already spoiled family and children and himself. Erich Fromm says, greed is a bottomless pit which exhausts the person in an endless effort to satisfy the need without ever reaching satisfaction. So this really cuts to the heart of it. What makes Murdaugh such a despicable monster, and I don't use that word lightly, is that he was a rich, respectable man, apparently respectable, from a privileged family, actively preying on the poor. This is the literal definition of how the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and how the rich become fat pigs at the trough of their ill-gotten gains. And yet after stealing so much, he was still unhappy, still unfulfilled, still taking pills in order to get the feeling that he needed. And then worst of all, after all that, still didn't have any money. Number 10, cheating other people is like sex. Well, I played that a few minutes ago. One actually has a sense that because Murdaugh was born into wealth, life is boring and dull. Everything is easy. There's no real challenge. One also has the sense of entitlement as a self-destructive itch that needs to be scratched, something similar to what we saw in the Robert Durst case. And so doesn't Murdaugh get a sense of personal and private self-esteem by outsmarting others again and again? Each time he lies and cheats, it gives him a visceral sense of how he is better and cleverer than everyone else.
For some people, cheating other people is almost like sex to them.
So if you look at this image of Curtis Smith and Alex Murdaugh side by side, in a very real sense, the man we see on the right is really no different from the ordinary Joe that was a common crook, common criminal on the left. The only difference is what the man on the right has to his advantage is the appearance of propriety, and that's his cover. No one will suspect him. And I do believe that he tried to frame Curtis Smith ultimately. Number 11, where are the Murdaugh millions? Where are they? Episode 3 suggests that a lot of money may have gone down the drain through gambling. And they show some footage of, I think, John Marvin and Buster Murdaugh at a casino in Vegas. And then you hear Alex Murdaugh talking about it. But it's also possible, if we're talking about institutionalized evil, that a lot of palms needed to be greased. Everyone gets their cut. But there's also a third possibility, and that is that some of those millions are still out there. And then number 12, Alex wanted Buster to go hunting at Moselle. You might not think that that is a big deal, but I think it sort of reveals something about Alex in a practical sense, his practical psychology in a way that is quite chilling and in a way quite new. So there's an interesting moment in the latter half of the final episode where Alex is talking to Buster from jail, asking him to go to Moselle and hunt deer. Buster understandably doesn't want to go near the place. I mean, it's where his mother and brother were murdered. And then Alex suggests, well, maybe his lawyer, Jim Griffin, should go there instead and hunt. And I think what this moment suggests is how Alex is really out of touch with real human emotions. Really, he wants his other son to go to the site where his mother and brother were murdered and hunt, take out a gun and shoot things. It also shows, in my opinion, potentially a cozy relationship between lawyers. Griffin originally represented Paul Murdaugh and then represented Paul's killer. And so it comes up, isn't there conflict of interest here in the documentary? It makes one wonder, are there other rich lawyers still above the law and breaking the law in Hampton County? Is Murdaugh really the only lawyer that got his hands as dirty as he did? Is Murdaugh the only lawyer with blood on his hands? The 7 deadly sins are lust, envy, anger, greed, gluttony, and sloth. All of them are bad, but pride is said to be the deadliest sin of all, the root of all evil, and the beginning of sin. During the Murdaugh trial, we had glimpses of all 7. Sloth, where Murdaugh himself claimed to be sleeping in front of the television while his wife and son worked at the kennels. Gluttony, given the shovel loads of opioids Murdaugh seemed to be taking. Lust, envy, and anger are all there too. But the word that seemed to be, to me, missing from the trial was greed. If pride set the Murdaugh ball in motion, greed kept it in motion. According to Lao Tzu, there is no greater disaster than greed. And I think we might point our fingers at this case and say, yes, that is so. But I think we can also point our fingers at ourselves. Look at the true crime creators and what they do in the name of greed. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.